Well, it's good to be gathered here in this virtual way, as is our way so much of the time in the year of pandemic. We have for a conversation, really a pastoral conversation, a Christian leadership conversation. We gather together, the three pastors of St. John's, my colleagues Amy Kinsley and John Haug, and also our Assistant Director of Outreach, Rebekah Turnbaugh, who is so helpful to me in conversations around subjects of kind of justice and what that all means. I called this meeting, you guys. I wanted to have this conversation around kind of an ongoing conversation around violence and nonviolence, and what that means for us as Christians. The latest, the latest thing in the news that caused this was the protest that happened. It was around trying a protest for something that we at St. John's is a high commitment for us around addressing homelessness, people who are unhoused. This happened though at our mayor's personal residence, Mayor Daryl Steinberg, and it became not just a protest, a peaceful protest, but ended up with vandalism and, according to the news reports, kind of threatening kind of language, things like chanting the names of our mayor's children, and it was kind of the latest of many ways in which we've been thinking about how do we, as people of God who are committed to justice and wanting change, how do we kind of see and respond to and address when something turns towards violence, property violence, violence to people, violence that's threatening and is terrifying, terrorist sort of conduct. And so one of the ways I learn is by having conversations with you. You always, all of you always help me understand things that I'm not seeing. And so I, wanted to just open up a conversation. We're going to do this in half an hour. This is in a line of conversations we've been having for about a year, because there's been many such incidents in our society, and also because I taught a class on nonviolence as a Christian practice, and in fact was really looking at how the scriptures. One of the ways in which we could be understanding the scriptures is that they are leading us, that God is leading us in a way that is not about the violent way of human beings, but the nonviolent, loving ways of God. So I'm opening this up. I have confession. I was I became very emotional about this latest incident at our mayor's house. I was angry. I thought that it was counterproductive to the work we're trying to do with homelessness when violence or vandalism and kind of aggressive behavior starts to try to make points. And so it got me thinking that what should we do about this? And I think we decided, we could have set out a two sentence or one sentence statement saying we condemn the violence that happened at our mayor's house, but maybe more useful than that is a teaching moment of a conversation together. So that's the stage that I've set to get us thinking about how to be a nonviolent people, how to affect change and make for justice. And what do we do with that? And have you guys been thinking about this and wondering about it along with me? We had the events at our Capitol. We had the Black Lives Matter protests this last spring and summer. So there's been a lot of movement, a lot of people wanting to change things. And so how are we as Christians to kind of think about and respond to that? That's my opening salvo, you guys. Who wants to go next?
I'll just say, I think that last part that you said, I've been thinking about it a lot for a while, but I think definitely since the summer, with the death of George Floyd, and then the Capitol, and even now a local event that's making us wonder. There's clearly in our country an overall dissatisfaction with some of the systems, and people not feeling like they're broken, right? The systems that they're not working for us in a general way. I mean, and different groups are feeling that way. And it's hard to know how to be heard. You know, people feel like they're not being heard. And that's not to justify anything, you know, not justifying what happened at the Capitol or other violence, but to say we have to, I think, be critical and at least want to listen to the root, like where is this coming from, and what, you know, because if there are this many people upset and are going to these extreme actions, and maybe not thoughtfully, but can we be thoughtful and want to at least get underneath and say, like, so, you know, so what is this, what is causing people to respond this way? Because there is, you know, and that's a Christian thing, right? Like our human systems are broken, right? And they will never look like God's kingdom. And what do we do about that? And how do we hear one another, even if we don't condone the actions taken? There is clearly a dissatisfaction and an anger or frustration that's there.
I would say, oh, go ahead, Rebekah.
I'd say one thing that I think about a lot, and I think that I long for, and think that we need is ways of holding one another accountable that are not punitive. And because punitive measures tend to harm and destroy. And that seems to be the only imagination that we have for accountability right now. And that might explain sort of the violence that was done at the mayor's house, and a lot of the violence that we see when people are feeling harmed by systems or left out of systems. And so, like, this is what I'm longing for, is how do we call people to account for their actions? You know, even now, even looking at the impeachment trial that's happening in the Senate right now, how do we call people into account, and also back lovingly into community, instead of this cancel culture of like, oh, we can't even engage with this person anymore because they're toxic, which really gives up on any like hope of redemption, which as Christians, I think we should always be hoping for redemption and always be striving for community and lovingly calling people back in. And so I just hope that as Christians, we can have more imagination around this.
I was just going to say really quickly to what Amy said, John, and then you can go, is that I also want to think about this, what we say for ourselves in our walk and our way as following Jesus. And that may not, those expectations for ourselves may not be the same that we put on other people who have different commitments and come from different places. That doesn't cancel out what we need to think about too. So, and we're called to a big imagination, Rebekah, with repentance and all of those things. So, John, I'm sorry, I just thought about that. Yeah, it's kind of two things there maybe at the same time.
My early thoughts, you know, when I heard about Mayor Steinberg's house being vandalized and the shouting of his children's names in their front door is terrifying. And we're all public leaders on this screen. And so, you know, just imagining that experience would be really terrifying and would have a lasting effect. So for me, that's unhelpful protest, or it ended up there. I don't know exactly how it began, but it certainly ended in a way that seems unhelpful. And I'm trying to think about all the protests we've seen and the conglomeration of things on the left and right. You know, Pastor Amy's right. There's a dissatisfaction across the nation. So we're seeing it from all sides. And when people get together, sometimes things get out of hand unless there's really careful training. I think that's one of the places the practice of Christian nonviolence could be helpful, having leaders in place around that. Yeah, I think about, you know, we're Protestants. We are in protest. This is how our kind of, you know, our walk of faith has come from a line of that. So we come from a line of being critical thinkers around systems that aren't running properly. and holding them accountable. I long for more imagination too, as Rebekah was saying. What seems different when I think about the success of the protests in the civil rights era, when Black and brown bodies weren't allowed at certain counters, and so they sat at them. And it was putting the shame of the system in front of the face of the system. And now that people are allowed in places, right, it's a little trickier. And so I think some of these protests are trying to disrupt what's going on, like blocking a highway, for example, so that you can't ignore it, because it's more subtle. It's like, how do you get the attention of people enough? You know, and so when I think back to some of the protests, I wonder, you know, what's the move now to get the attention if you feel in your community or your constituents aren't being heard? How do you do that in a way that's not violent, but gets the right attention of the community or whatever your object is? So those are some of my early thoughts.
Yeah, I
was
think
wondering-
that we. Oh,
Go ahead, Rebekah. No, go ahead.
I would just think, you know, the reference to the civil rights movement decades ago. I think we oftentimes idealize those because now in hindsight we see their success, but at the time they were not welcomed protest, and there was violence acted upon the people who were protesting nonviolently. And we all know that Dr. King was assassinated for his nonviolent work. And so I just always want to caution to not overly romanticize that movement, because there was great violence there too. So anyway.
And I was thinking too about the idea of like in the case that happened at Mayor Steinberg's house, it seems, you know, it was on behalf of our unhoused neighbors, right? And people had died, and that was, of course, a tragedy. And this idea of, you know, who is protesting, right? I think the civil rights movement was lifted up. It was the voice of the people who were experiencing the injustice, empowered, and, you know, and also allies along with, right? So I'm trying to think, you know, does it matter who is protesting, you know, who is part of the protest too? You know, were there unhoused folks like empowered to protest, or were these people sort of being saviors? You know, we talk about white saviors, right? Like, are we just going ahead of people? I learned a little bit about like advocacy by making mistakes in advocacy, that I was going out ahead of the people. Like, you know, when I spent time in Palestine and in the West Bank, it's like, sometimes I felt like, oh, I see this injustice and I need to like be voicing it in a way that actually was not helpful to the people I was supposed to be walking really alongside and letting them lead. And I don't know that that was the case in this situation with the mayor's house, but I think there is this question that we have to ask ourselves, like, who is doing the protest, and are we really empowering the voices of the people that are experiencing the injustice, or are we acting like, you know, do we want to see ourselves as social justice people, you know, and so I want to appear like I'm, you know, I'm for justice, right? And so I go out ahead of the people that I'm actually trying to, whose voices I'm actually saying I want to advocate for, right? And so that's maybe a more general thing than, you know, the particulars of this more local event, but I think that's what I'm wondering, I guess, about that, and how do we do that if we feel like, well, those voices aren't being heard at all? Like, do we go out ahead, or do we do the harder work of trying to like empower and lift up?
I was thinking about what you said, Rebekah, that, you know, the kind of massively organized nonviolent protests under the NAACP and the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all of that effort, there was a huge commitment to nonviolence, but it didn't mean violence didn't get directed at them. And I think that was kind of the thing that was amazing about that movement. It was willing to sacrifice for the sake of a longer view further out. And I think nonviolence sometimes is really based on that view further out than what is being experienced right now. And so it pays a price. And I like Pastor John used the word, it kind of shamed white America. There was some, I think of it, eyes kind of got open. I remember my parents around a black and white TV, kind of like, and I was a kid, I couldn't figure out what in the world was going on, but there was definitely something being awakened in my family around this. So, and the one other thing I just want to say is, to me, another helpful theological idea is justification. You know, we as Lutherans love to say we're justified by faith through grace, that it's God who justifies. But then we spend, not just Lutherans, but all of humanity spends the rest of our lives trying to justify ourselves and our wants and our actions. And I do think that anytime that we lose track of God being the one who justifies and makes right, and start to like kind of try to negotiate this ourselves, we can end up in a place we didn't expect to be, a violent place we didn't expect to be, an angry place we didn't expect to be. So for me, as Christians, we want to kind of understand that God's justification leads us out there in a kind of open, willing way to try to stand with and for people, but not trick ourselves into this weird stance that often ends up as violence, anger, and those sorts of things. So it's a practice, I think, that's open for us as Christians in the Lutheran tradition to consider. Who's justifying and why?
Yeah, and I think there is this sense in our society right now that justified anger allows us to do anything in a way. Like, I don't see a lot of boundaries on that sometimes, you know, like if I'm right about this, then I can like do whatever it takes to get that heard. Yeah, so it's kind of troubling that way. And, you know, and I think as you said, the civil rights movement, there was a strategy and they expected violence to come from the system, right? Like, so they practiced it to say, how are we going to not respond when we get beaten or when, you know, there will be violence against us. You know, and I think too, like in like with the Black Lives Matter protest or the protest for racial justice, right? More currently, I think it's easy to point out the violence that had happened at the protest, but not look at like violence that had happened prior to that at the hands of the system, right? And that can be justified violence, right? Like as long as it's done within the constraints of like law enforcement or military action, then violence is okay because it was part of like the state's sanctioned violence, right? As opposed to like the people, you know, parts of the protest becoming violent, you know, sometimes we have to be careful too that we don't, that we aren't always on the side of the systems that will justify their violence as like a necessary order keeping, right? As opposed to violence that may happen because it is hard to control when people get together, like Pastor John said, like when people get together, you can't always control what happens, but there can be a delegitimizing of the message because there was some violence, but violence in response is okay because it was sanctioned by the system. So I don't know. So I wrestle with that, like how do you draw the lines there, or how do you say, you know, what is okay and what is not?
Can we speak both things at the same time? And then Pastor John, I'm wondering what you're pondering there, but can we say we understand that human beings will reach out in anger and do things, and also say as followers of Jesus that that's not that's not productive, that's not good, and try to teach other ways. I mean, I think both sides, you're trying to protect, Pastor Amy, about one side trying to justify all that came before by kind of pointing to something that happened currently, but it seems to me that is a very legitimate point, and what's happening now also is not to the glory of God and really beneficial to addressing what's happening. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
Can I hold on to both those things and talk about them well? It's hard sometimes. I think we struggled with that this last year, how to do that. What are you thinking about, Pastor John?
Yeah, protests are a way for community to release anger and frustration in a way that is hopefully productive, because internalizing it is destructive. And so what we saw around, thinking back to the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's death, and we got together, to say, and there was property destruction at some of them, and it was a confusing time. I remember those protests. Some of the early ones, there's a group of people that disguise their identity in these protests, and then there seems to be people that aren't. And it seemed to be a lot of the destruction was happening through a group that was disguising themselves. I've heard about the group Antifa, doing some of that destructive. And then it seemed like the protests separated out a bit later on. And the earlier ones were peaceful, and the ones that went into the night continued to have some of that property violence. But, so we, I remember as leaders, talked about, well, what do we say into this moment? Also as white church leaders, we didn't want our voice to sound belittling of a tragedy experienced in the Black and brown community again. That precipitating violence. It was George Floyd was maybe this watershed moment, but many others before it. So we didn't want to dismiss that real pain in community, and yet we were distraught at the same time with destruction very near our property at St. John's, and didn't want to condone that either. So I hear some of what you're saying too, Frank. How do you do both of these things well is really kind of a practice. I was speaking to someone who has been trained in nonviolence, and the time to do the training is not while the conflict's going on. The time to do the training is well ahead of it. That's why you have to get prepared, because it goes counter to human instinct and emotion to react to violence and a threat in a nonviolent and non-threatening way. It's the opposite. When someone shouts, you want to shout back. And so it's literally a training against our human nature. And that, I think, is what we saw in the civil rights movement that was really kind of profound. So that's some of my, as I'm thinking and listening around the square here, the rectangle, what are we?
Yeah. Pastor Amy and Rebekah, we're getting close to time. Do you have a last thought to share? Maybe Rebekah first and then Pastor Amy?
Sure. So, for this particular instance that sparked this conversation, the vandalism at the mayor's house, the threat there, it was around what one Sacramento Bee reporter called a night of terror, in which at least 6 unhoused people died in the storm on January 27th. And the city manager refused to open a warming center that night, despite frequent requests from council members and the mayor. And so I want to highlight that the city right now is working on developing sort of a master plan to address homelessness and siting places, funding it, all of that kind of stuff. And I am serving on the District 4 Homeless Task Force to address this in District 4, which is where St. John's is at, with Councilmember Katie Valenzuela. And there are other council members who are doing this hard work too. But it is not clear that all council members are engaged in this work as deeply. And so I think I want to put out there an urge to the congregation to reach out to your council member and ask them what they're doing around this master plan work to address homelessness, because it is a deep, deep need in our community. And we all feel it, whether we're housed or unhoused, whether we really want to sort of engage fully in it, we see it in our communities. And so I would urge you to reach out to your council member and ask what they're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Rebekah. Yeah, I guess just a last thought. I mean, I kind of want Rebekah's thought to be one of the last thoughts, but to really encourage people. But I think as Christians, you know, I wrote down in response to what one of you all said, that I think, you know, what did I write down? Oh, you know, that we, you know, others acting in the world are not necessarily acting out of a Christian framework, right? So to reiterate that we always have to respond out of our Christian faith. And I think that all the things that happen in the world require us to be critical and discerning out of our faith, right? Like, so what as a follower of Jesus am I called to do, right? And I think like, and then we have to keep God's promised kingdom sort of as the template. Like if our ultimate desire is for this world to look more like God's kingdom, which is the peace that only Christ brings and the justice that only God kind of lays out for, you know, that God wishes for the world, then, you know, we really need to keep that as our focus and think, well, how do I get closer to that? And so sometimes you have to be creative. It's not like an easy solution to ending violence or to ending the injustice. And sometimes I think we're pretty heavy-handed in the world, the way the world is, right? Like we just go and we yell about it, or we go and we act violently, or, you know, because it's the only thing we can think to do. But I think as Christians, we have tools at our disposal, prayer and discerning together and returning to the scriptures, you know, and I think at St. John's, I know we're committed to that work together and are trying to find more and more ways to do that together. So, so that's my hope, that we can just be a little more discerning when these things happen. And really, I'm thankful for these kinds of conversations that we can help to raise in our community to do that together.
Amy, just as Rebekah, you wanted to lift her last word up as yours, I want to lift yours up as mine. And that's exactly where I was thinking a great ending for this is you know, the Christian way is not the only way, but it's our way. And we respect the ways of other people where they have kind of values that are just incredible. But for us, this practice of the life in Christ includes the practice of nonviolence and justice making and prayer and worship. And we get to do that together. And so let's come together and we're preparing this as a conversation for our people to watch, and then email any one of us, call us. We'd love to talk more about this. This is not up on a pedestal sort of teaching. This is just the ways we can do it right now. And we thought we would do it in a recorded form, and would love to hear from all of you. Not everything here was that from any of our mouths was kind of the last word on this or the most brilliantly uttered, but we're trying, and we want to be a part of this work. So it's great. Thank you, all three of you, for willing to put your face up on the screen and to say what you're thinking about this. And we will continue to pray and work for justice and for peace to reign in this way that is the hope of Christ. So thank you all for watching, and be in touch with us. We'll see you soon. Bye.